Hello, reading room. We're outside on day 153 of the classroom. But more importantly for you, we are on day 8 of our book, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So, we're finishing up chapter 7. As a second step to familiarizing ourselves with the virtue of patience, it is also very helpful. Let me see this for a second. Yeah. It is also very helpful to think of adversity not so much as a threat to our peace of mind, but rather as the very means by which patience is attained. Adversity. From this perspective, we see that those who would harm us are, in a sense, teachers of patience. Such people teach us what we could never learn merely from hearing someone speak, be they ever so wise or holy. No more can the reader hope to learn virtue merely by reading this book, unless, of course, it is so boring as to demand perseverance. From adversity, we can, however, learn the value of patient forbearance. And in particular, those who would harm us give us unparalleled opportunities to practice disciplined behavior. This is not to say that people are not responsible for their actions, but let us remember that they may be acting largely out of ignorance. A child brought up in a violent environment may not know any other way to behave. As a result, the question of blame is rendered largely redundant. The appropriate response is someone who causes us to suffer. And here, of course, I am not referring to those instances when others oppose us legitimately, as when they refuse to give in to our unreasonable demands, is to recognize that in harming us, ultimately, they lose their peace of mind, their inner balance, and thereby their happiness. And we do best when we have compassion for them, especially since a simple wish to see them hurt cannot actually harm them. It will certainly harm us, though. Imagine two neighbors in a dispute. One of them is able to take this dispute lightly. The other is obsessed with it and constantly schemes to find a way to hurt his or her opponent. But what happens? Nurturing malice, it is not long before the one who broods begins to suffer. First, he or she will lose their appetite, then their sleep. Eventually, their health begins to go. They pass their days and nights in misery, with the result that, ironically, they end up fulfilling the wishes of their adversary. In fact, when we really think about it, there is something not fully rational about singling out individual persons as the objects of our anger. Let us conduct a simple exercise in our imagination. Consider the case of someone who abuses us verbally. If we feel inclined to anger on account of the pain this causes us, should not the focus of our feelings really be on the words themselves, since these are what is actually causing us the pain? Yet we become angry with the individual who is shouting at us. It could, of course, be objected that since it is the person who is doing the shouting, we are justified in becoming angry with them on the grounds that we are right to assign moral responsibility to the individual and not to his or her words. This may be true. At the same time, if we are to be angry at what actually caused the pain, their words are actually the more immediate cause. Better still, should we not direct our anger toward what drove that person to abuse us, their afflictive emotions? For if the person were calm and at peace, they would not act in this way. Yet of these three factors, the words which hurt, the person uttering them, and the negative impulses which drive them, it is toward the person that we direct our anger. There is something inconsistent in this. If it be objected that it is the nature of the one who is abusing us which is truly the cause of our pain, still we would have no reasonable grounds for anger with that individual. For if it were that person's ultimate nature to be hostile toward us, They would be incapable of behaving differently. In that case, anger toward them would be pointless. If we are burned, there is no sense in being angry with fire. It is in the nature of fire to burn, but to remind ourselves that the notion of inherent hostility or inherent evil is false. Let us observe that under different circumstances, the same person who is causing us pain could become a good friend. It is not unusual to hear of soldiers on opposing sides during conflict becoming close in peacetime. And most of us have had the experience of meeting someone who, despite a bad reputation in the past, turns out to be quite pleasant. Of course, I am not suggesting that we should engage in such reflections as these in every situation. When we are physically threatened, we might do better to concentrate our energy not on reasoning like this, but in running away. But it is helpful to spend time familiarizing ourselves with the various aspects and benefits of patience. This will enable us to meet the challenges posed by adversity in a constructive manner. Getting my back adjusted. Not literally. I mentioned earlier that sopa or patience acts as a counterforce to anger. In fact, for every negative state, we find that we can identify one which opposes it. We're looking at those actually in our DIY class, not for opposing negatives and opposing states, but actually for positives and opposing states. For example, humility opposes pride. Contentment opposes greed. Perseverance opposes indolence. If, therefore, we wish to overcome the suffering which arises when negative thoughts and emotions are allowed to develop, cultivating virtue should not be seen as separate from restraining our response to them. The Dalai Lama actually, and mind and body conferences were pretty pinnacle in getting positive psychology to move in its direction. So much Eastern thought went into positive psychology. Cultivating virtue should not be seen as separate from restraining our response to them. They go hand in hand. This is why ethical discipline cannot be confined either to mere restraint or to mere affirmation of positive qualities. To see how this process of restraint coupled with counteraction works, let us consider anxiety. We can describe this as a form of fear, but one with a well-developed mental component. Now we are bound to encounter experiences and events we feel concerned about, but what turns concern into anxiety is when we start to brood and let the imagination add negative reflections. Then we begin to feel anxious and start to worry. And the more we indulge this, the more reasons we find for it. Eventually we may find ourselves in a state of permanent distress. The more developed this state, the less we are able to take action against it and the stronger it becomes. But when we think carefully, we see that underlying this process is principally narrowness of vision and a lack of proper perspective. This causes us to ignore the fact that things and events come into being as the result of innumerable causes and conditions, and we tend to concentrate on just one or two aspects of our situation. For example, we attribute our suffering solely to negative childhood experiences, but in doing so, inevitably, we restrict ourselves to finding means to overcoming only these aspects. The trouble with this is that if we are unable to do so, there is a danger of becoming totally demoralized. The first step in overcoming anxiety is thus to develop a proper perspective in our situation. We talk about that for forgiveness as well, a proper perspective, developing a proper perspective of your situation. This we can do in a number of different ways. One of the most effective is to try to shift the focus of attention away from self and toward others. When we succeed in this, we find that the scale of our own problems diminishes. This is not to say we should ignore our own needs altogether, but rather that we should try to remember others' needs alongside our own, no matter how pressing ours may be. This is helpful because when our concern for others is translated into action, we find that confidence arises automatically and worry and anxiety diminish. Indeed, we find that almost all the mental and emotional suffering, which is such a feature of modern living, including the sense of hopelessness, of loneliness, and so on, lessens the moment we begin to engage in actions motivated by concern for others. In my opinion, this explains why merely performing outwardly positive actions will not suffice to reduce anxiety. When the underlying motive is to further one's short-term aims, we only add to our problems. What though of those occasions when we find our whole lives unsatisfactory, or when we feel on the point of being overwhelmed by our suffering? Food to eat, clothes to wear, somewhere to live. We may have performed certain altruistic deeds in the past, not unlike a banker who collects interest even on the smallest amounts of money he has out on a loan. We must take into consideration even the slightest positive aspect of our lives. For if we fail to find some way of uplifting ourselves, there is every danger of sinking further into our sense of powerlessness. This can lead us to believe that we have no capacity for doing good whatsoever. Thus, we create the condition of despair itself. At that point, suicide may seem the only option. Notice here the whole time that we're creating this with every step, this condition of despair. In most cases of hopelessness and despair, we find that it is the individual's perception of their situation rather than its reality which is the issue. Certainly it may not be resolvable without others' cooperation. In that case, it becomes a matter of asking for help. However, there may indeed be some circumstances which are hopeless. This is where religious belief can be a source of comfort, but that is a separate matter. What else might be an ethical virtue? What else might an ethic of virtue consist in? As a general principle, it is essential to avoid extremes. Just as overeating is as dangerous as undereating, so it is with the pursuit and practice of virtue. We find that even noble causes, when carried to extremes, can become a source of harm. Again, DIY, character strengths and excess is what we're saying. For example, courage taken to excess and without due regard for circumstances quickly becomes foolhardiness. Indeed, excess undermines one of the principal purposes of practicing virtue, which is to offset our tendency to drastic mental and emotional reactions to others and to those events which cause us unavoidable suffering. It is also important to realize that transforming the mind and heart so that our actions become spontaneously ethical requires that we put the pursuit of virtue at the heart of our daily lives. This is because love and compassion, patience, generosity, humility, and so on are all complementary. And because it is so difficult to eradicate afflictive emotion, it is necessary that we habituate ourselves to other opposites even before negative thoughts and emotions arise. For example, the cultivation of generosity is essential to counteract our tendency to guard our possessions and even our energy too closely. The practice of giving helps us to overcome our habit of miserliness, which we tend to justify by asking, what will I have for myself if I start giving things away? Giving is recognized as a virtue in every major religion and every civilized society, and it clearly benefits both the giver and the receiver. The one who receives is relieved from the pangs of want. The one who gives can take comfort from the joy their gift brings to others. At the same time, we must recognize that there are different types and degrees of giving. When we give with the underlying motive of inflating the image of others that others have of us, we defile the act of giving. In that case, what we are practicing is not generosity, but self-aggrandizement. Similarly, the one who gives much may not be so generous as the one who gives little. It all depends on the giver's means and motivation. Though not a substitute, giving of our time and energy may represent a somewhat higher order of giving than making gifts. Here I am thinking especially of the gift of service to those with mental or physical disabilities, to the homeless, to those who are lonely, to those in prison, and those who have been in prison. But this type of giving also includes, for example, teachers who impart their knowledge to students. Then, as I understand it, the most compassionate form of giving is when it is done without any thought or expectation of reward and grounded in genuine concern for others. Just saying. This is because the more we can expand our focus to include others' interests alongside our own, the more securely we build the foundations of our own happiness. To say that humility is an essential ingredient in our pursuit of transformation may seem to be at odds with what I have said about the need for confidence. But just as there is clearly a distinction between valid confidence in the sense of self-esteem and conceit, which we can describe as an inflated sense of importance grounded in a false image of self, so it is important to distinguish between genuine humility, which is a species of modesty, and a lack of confidence. They are not the same thing at all, though many confuse them. This may explain in part why today humility is often thought of as a weakness rather than as an indication of inner strength. So one of the reasons why I taught it in my character building class, humility. Certainly modern society does not accord humility the place it had in Tibet when I was young. Then both our culture and people's basic admiration of humility provided a climate in which it flourished, while ambition, to be differentiated from the entirely appropriate aspiration to succeed in wholesome tasks, was seen as a quality which leads all too easily to self-centered thinking. Yet in contemporary life, humility is more important than ever. The more successful we humans become, both as individuals and as family, through our development of science and technology, the more essential it becomes to preserve humility. For the greater our temporal achievements, the more vulnerable we become to pride and arrogance. One technique helpful in developing real confidence and humility is to reflect on the example of those whose self-importance makes them an object of ridicule to others. They may not be aware of how foolish they look, but it is plain to everyone else. Think of former presidents. This is not a matter of sitting in judgment on others, however. Rather, it is a question of bringing home to ourselves the negative consequences of such states of heart and mind. By seeing through the example of others where they lead, when we will be all the more determined to avoid them. In a sense, we are reversing the principle of not harming others on the basis that we ourselves do not wish to be harmed, and making use of the fact that it is much easier to identify others' failures than it is to acknowledge their virtues, and also to identify them in ourselves, right? It is also much easier to find fault with others than with ourselves. Here I should perhaps add that if humility is not to be confused with lack of confidence, still less has it anything to do with a sense of worthlessness. Lack of proper recognition of one's own value is always harmful and can lead to a state of mental, emotional, and spiritual paralysis. Under such circumstances, the individual may even come to hate themselves, although I must admit that the concept of self-hatred seems incoherent when it was first explained to me by some Western psychologists. It seemed to contradict the principle that our fundamental desire is to be happy and to avoid suffering. Self-hatred, right? But I do now accept that when a person loses all sense of perspective, there is a danger of self-hatred. Yet we all have the capacity for empathy. We all therefore have the potential to engage in wholesome conduct, even if this only takes the form of positive thoughts. To suppose ourselves worthless is simply incorrect. Another way to avoid the narrowing of vision that can lead to such extreme states as self-hatred and despair is to rejoice in others' good fortune where we find it. As part of this practice, it is helpful to take every opportunity to show our respect for others, even to encourage them with praise when that seems appropriate. If such praise seems likely to come across as flattery or to make them feel conceited, it may, of course, be better to keep our goodwill private. And when it is we ourselves who are being praised, it is vital not to let this make us feel puffed up and important. Instead, let us merely recognize the other's generosity and appreciating our good qualities. As a means of overcoming those negative feelings towards ourselves, which arise in connection with those occasions in the past when we have neglected others' feelings and indulge our own selfish desires and interests at their expense, it is very helpful to develop an attitude of regret and repentance. All right, so we are overcoming negative feelings that arise because we have neglected others' feelings and indulge in our own desires, right? So it's helpful to develop an attitude of regret and repentance. That's what he just said. Here, though, the reader should not suppose that I am advocating the sense of guilt which so many of my Western friends speak of. We do not seem to have a word in Tibetan which could translate the word guilt. Exactly. Amazing. And because of its strong cultural associations, I am not certain that I have understood the concept to its fullest extent. But it seems to me that while it is natural and to be expected that we should have feelings of discomfort in relation to our past misdeeds, there is sometimes an element of self-indulgence when this is extended to feelings of guilt. It makes no sense to brood anxiously on the harmful actions we have committed in the past to the point where we become paralyzed. They are done. It is over. If the person is a believer in God, the appropriate action is to find some means of reconciliation with Him. So far as Buddhist practice is concerned, there are various rites and practices for purification. When the individual has no religious beliefs, however, it is surely a matter of acknowledging and accepting any negative feelings we may have in relation to our misdeeds and developing a sense of sorrow and regret for them. But then, rather than stopping at mere sorrow and regret, it is important to use this as a basis for resolve, for a deep-seated commitment never again to harm others, and to direct our actions all the more determinedly to the benefit of others. The act of disclosure or confession of our negative actions to another, especially to someone we really respect and trust, will be found to be very helpful in this. Above all, we should remember that as long as we retain the capacity of concern for others, the potential for transformation remains. We are quite wrong if we merely acknowledge the gravity of our actions inwardly and then, instead of confronting our feelings, give up all hope and do nothing. Apathy. This only compounds the error. We have a saying in Tibet that engaging in the practice of virtue is as hard as driving a donkey uphill, whereas engaging in destructive activities is as easy as rolling boulders downhill. It is also said that negative impulses arise spontaneously as rain and gather momentum, just like water following the course of gravity. What makes matters worse is our tendency to indulge negative thoughts and emotions even while agreeing that we should not. It is essential, therefore, to address directly our tendency to put things off and while away our time in meaningless activities and shrink from the challenge of transforming our habits on the grounds that it is too great a task. In particular, it is important not to allow ourselves to be put off by the magnitude of others' suffering. The misery of millions is not a cause for pity. Rather, it is a cause for developing compassion. We must also recognize that the failure to act when it is clear that action is required may itself be a negative action. Where inaction is due to anger or malice or envy, afflictive emotion can be clearly cited as the motivating factor. This is as true of simple things as it is of more complex situations. If a husband does not warn his wife that a plate she is about to pick up is hot because he desires her to be burned, clearly afflictive emotion is likely to be present. And when he keeps saying afflictive emotion, negative emotions, right? That the concentration is on that they afflict ourselves. On the other hand, where inaction is simply the result of indolence, the mental and emotional state of the individual may not be so gravely negative, but the consequence may still be very serious, although such inaction is attributable less to negative thoughts and emotions as to a lack of compassion. It is thus important that we are no less determined to overcome our habitual tendency to laziness, indolence, than we are to exercise restraint in response to afflictive emotion. This is not so easy task, and those who are religiously minded must understand that there is no blessing or initiation which, if only we could receive it, or any mysterious or magical formula or mantra or ritual, if only we could discover it, that can enable us to achieve transformation instantly. It comes little by little, just as building is constructed brick by brick, or as a Tibetan expression has it, an ocean is formed drop by drop. Also because unlike our bodies, which soon get sick, old, and worn out, the afflictive emotions never age. It is important to realize that dealing with them is a lifelong struggle, nor should the reader suppose that what we are talking about here is the mere acquisition of knowledge. It is not even a question of developing the conviction that may come from such knowledge. What we are talking about is gaining an experience of virtue through constant practice and familiarization so that it becomes spontaneous. What we find is that the more we develop concern for others' well-being, the easier it becomes to act in others' interest. As with everything, right? The more we do it, the easier it becomes. As we become habituated to the effort required, so the struggle to sustain it lessens. Eventually, it will become second nature, but there are no shortcuts. Engaging in virtuous activities is a bit like bringing up a young child. A great many factors are involved, and especially at the beginning, we need to be prudent and skillful in our endeavors to transform our habits and dispositions. Prudent was a word that we learned in Early Birds. We also need to be realistic about what we can expect to achieve. It took us a long time to become the way we are, and habits are not changed overnight. So while it is good to raise our sights as we progress, it is a mistake to judge our behavior by using the ideal as a standard, just as in college it would be foolish to judge our child's performance as a first-year student from the perspective of a graduate. Graduation is the ideal, not the standard. For this reason, far more effective than short bursts of heroic effort followed by periods of laxity is to work steadily like a stream flowing toward our goal of transformation. One method that is very helpful in sustaining us in this lifelong task of transformation is to adopt a daily routine which can be adjusted according to our progress. Of course, as with the practice of virtue in general, this is something religious practice encourages, but that is no reason why non-believers should not use some of the ideas and techniques which have served humanity so well over the course of millennia. Making the habit of concern for others' well-being and spending a few minutes on walking in the morning, reflecting on the value of conducting our lives in an ethically disciplined manner is a good way to start the day, no matter what our beliefs or lack of them. Joaquin Duato. The same is true of taking some time at the end of each day to review how successful in this we have been. Such a discipline is very helpful in developing our determination not to behave self-indulgently. If these suggestions sound somewhat onerous to the reader searching not for nirvana but salvation, but simply for human happiness, it is worth reminding ourselves that what brings us the greatest joy and satisfaction in life are those actions we undertake out of concern for others. Indeed, we can go further, for whereas the fundamental questions of human existence, such as why we are here, where we are going, and whether the universe had a beginning, have each elicited different responses in different philosophical traditions, it is self-evident that a generous heart and wholesome actions lead to greater peace and ethical discipline. That was chapter 7. We will come back here for chapter 8, The Ethic of Compassion. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We're here in the reading room. We are reading the book Ethics in a New Millennium by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. Thanks for joining me. We'll be back because we started our 3 days on after our 4 days off to get all our thoughts collected. Thanks for joining me here in the classroom with the teacher and little Lucy in the background.